I'd like to speak on dukkha, which we introduced yesterday as that constricted kinetic within the interiority of the body where we experience suffering, contraction, closure of our spacious nature. So the Buddha always said that all he really taught, because of course he had kings and monks and very esteemed academics traveling from very far and from very wide to seek insight from him. And so they'd come and ask him all types of inquiries. One in particular that people seemed to inquire when they had time with him was about the afterlife, or the meanings of dreams they've had, and inquiries into the supernatural realm. And the Buddha, as a historical figure, not a religious archetype, but as a scholar, and really I think of him as a scientist, just experimentation with the formless realms and the way that the mind occupies habit. So as a scholar and a scientist, these great and noble monks and esteemed kings in all walks of life would come and seek counsel with him, and he would always say, particularly to the questions about the supernatural realm, he would say, I only teach two things: suffering and the eradication of suffering. That's it. So when he woke up, when he became enlightened, the Four Noble Truths were his first teachings, and he spent his life teaching. But the very first teaching he gave was this list, as a vessel to try to convey as pithily as possible the truths that he had just absorbed. He kind of explains his awakening as like the receiving of this great quench of thirst, like a water. And spirit, in a lot of traditions, I know Judaism speaks a lot about the water essence as spirit. They say fish are the most spiritual animal because they never close their eyes. They're just enmeshed in spirit underwater, just seeking. I love that imagery. The Buddha, too, spoke about spiritual understanding as this water essence, and the Four Noble Truths, he said, was the jug that he constructed to try to offer this water to others. So why not start there? If we're going to dive into the Dharma, let's start with what the Buddha thought was the most essential teachings. The very first noble truth. Dukkha exists. Suffering, part of the path, you signed up for it. Maybe you forgot, but you signed the contract somewhere along the line that you will experience anguish in this life. It's so liberating and so compassionate of him to have started the teachings in that lens, because it allows us the width in our emotional landscape to host discomfort and actually relax and soften around that experience rather than berate ourselves as if we've done something wrong because things aren't going perfectly. So I mentioned yesterday the 2 arrows to suffering. You get hit with the first arrow like something from the hell realm visits you. And that hurts. But so many of us are also hit with the second arrow of suffering, which is not just the experience of that stimulus, but the spiraling narrative about whether or not we deserved that experience to happen or how long we're going to be in pain, or what we've done wrong, why we were standing in the line of fire. Like we must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. So this first noble truth just points to the fact that mishaps are part of the path. You haven't been led astray. It's actually the most useful material for your own evolution. And I really encourage you to look back at the times where you felt the most lost and recognize that that's still like this deep, quiet stream has been actually nourishing your motivation as a practitioner now. It allows us a very radically liberated perspective on suffering, where we actually appreciate all the loss we've encountered. It doesn't mean we have to like it. And the Dalai Lama speaks on preferences often. I think there's a misunderstanding in Buddhist practice that we shouldn't have preferences. Of course you're not going to want more suffering to come to you. That's a natural survival mechanism. And of course we want more pleasantries to visit us. It's not the preferences that are the problem. The Dalai Lama, in a famous Dharma talk he gave, he said, he had a room, I can't even imagine the aesthetics, but just probably thousands of insight seekers, just waiting to be washed in his water wisdom. And he started the speech, I hate it when my ice cream melts on a hot day. And I hate it when I give a Dharma talk for hours about a concept and then a student comes up after and asks me if I'm going to cover the exact thing that I've just been talking about. And he goes on and on to list all of these preferences he has to highlight that however skillful of a practitioner you are, you're still going to have this basic human tendency to lean into desire and push away from aversion. So that's not the problem. The problem manifests when we react to whether or not our preferences are being met. So should the ice cream melt on a hot day, how do you respond when the universe does what you don't want it to do? That's why we practice. And that's the second noble truth, is that our reactivity causes our anguish. The way we become ignited or disheveled based on the fluctuations of living a life. I feel the second noble truth also lends itself well to that kind of psychological kinetic I mentioned yesterday about the 2 waves of experience, or the 2 arrows, stimulus and our response. So if we're very reactive, that second wave comes crashing down upon us. But this also leads us to the third noble truth, which is that we can make a space between experience oncoming, impending, and the way that we respond to it. So space between the first and second wave might be defined as nirvana. So pragmatic. Awakening is not some distant esoteric shore, like one day if I do enough breath of fire and drink enough kale juice, it probably might help because I really feel that digestion supports inner method. But it's just the calm capacity to host what's emerging without fighting against it or grasping for more of it. Because in a way, getting your preferences met actually also contributes to just as much suffering as not getting your needs met. Because if your ice cream doesn't melt, I'm just going to try to keep going with this analogy, we'll see where it goes. If your ice cream doesn't melt and it brings you joy, and the next day you go and get ice cream and then it does melt, there's an increased irritation because your expectations brought you to a place of really clinging to an outcome. And now you haven't trained the inner method of resiliency and understanding that disappointments and disillusionments are part of the path. And you know how to meet yourself as, the cone drips around you in a puddle. So it's like, whether our needs are getting met or not, we're going to have suffering because at some point our needs aren't going to be met. So we can train how to meet ourselves. Or we can continue that kind of monkey mind, eccentric distractibility of just trying to make sure that our needs are met all the time. And the moment that they're not, the moment that injury comes, for example, I love this example of feeling like a vigorous yoga practice has to be part of your spiritual life, because there will be times where you're incapacitated, and then what do you do?
I said, you do a training.
You refill your cup with the wisdom methods. How do I sit with the self when suffering comes? Because it will. Not when, not if, but when. So the third noble truth just says that we can find an awakened path that diminishes anguish by training up the inner method to be less reactive to the fluctuations of life. And the fourth truth is the introduction to a much larger tenet that the Buddha introduces as the way to less and less anguish, and that's the Noble Eightfold Path, which is just a recipe where he outlines the ingredients for a holistic, non-grasping, extraordinary life. Liberation just means we're not bound to our preferences being met. And that path I won't speak on today. There are many resources to delve into that, but just as a basic nod to these ingredients, they include things like speech and how we narrate our experience, and also how we talk to the self, and mental patterns, mental training, different behaviors and attitudes that we might cultivate, how we connect interpersonally with others, our line of work, things that could either contribute to greater delusion and suffering or more freedom and liberation. Now, the Buddha was a prolific speaker. And in all of the sermons that he gave, there was one word he used more than any other. And the word is bhavana. Bhavana. Meaning to cultivate. Such a pragmatic dude. He said, this has to be a practice. You train in the methods. You lean into them so that you might begin to embody them when you need it, because we don't know what's ahead. So if I were to give a verb to this entire Four Noble Truth formula, it would be examine or explore. Get to know your suffering. Cultivate the bhavana of a healthy relationship to what causes you anguish. And I received this really potent inquiry yesterday about navigating loss and cultivating acceptance. Right? So in grief, there's sadness and loss and sorrow and anger, and I think it's one of the most brutal but effective teachers. It's loss. Well, the inquiry is, with someone in particular that's transitioned, there's more sadness and anger and a ripple of fear than there is acceptance. So I want to bring to light what acceptance, what examining and exploration of suffering means. Because so much of Western yoga paradigm is interested in the bliss body, where nirvana means suddenly you can hear the angels calling your name, and there's lightness of being and expansion and mostly joy. Now that's definitely a side effect of a proper dosage of a practice. Like, you'll have that. But if that's all you're hoping for, then you're missing half of the story. Acceptance is not about just sloughing off the things that are causing us grief so that we no longer feel sadness or anger. It's actually widening our capacity to still be content, even though anger will always potentially be part of our system. So accepting loss or the grief process is not about hoping to get to some distant shore where one day we don't wake up with heaviness in our heart. It's actually learning how to wake up and honor the heaviness just as evenly as we would honor the lightness. So acceptance by very nature doesn't mean the eradication of fear. It means a wider inner altar where we can place fear right next to celebration or success. That's yoga, meaning union or to integrate. We're not just hoping for one particular stream of experience. We're interested as insight seekers to widen our capacity to hold all the textures and the tones, the buffet of our beingness, which includes loss because we are impermanent, like a tiny splash of a raindrop. Brief, vital display of life. Jack Kornfield calls it the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows of being human. Some of us signed up to experience 10,000. There are other souls that are content swimming a shallower stream, and they may not experience the depth of anguish that others have, but you can be sure that their experience of the bliss body is also narrowed. So we just get to choose. And I'm sure for those of you that have sunk into those caves of depression, you've also been able to feel the contrast of what it feels like to have crawled out of that cave. Those of us that crawl in and out of those caves are the most impactful teachers, I really feel. There's also an inquiry that arose about what practices have assisted me in my personal practice that allows for the container of acceptance to hold more weight. And there is a breath practice that we'll do together this evening called Tonglen, which means giving and receiving, where we give attention to our dukkha, to our contracted or calloused, constricted parts. And rather than what we normally want to do, which is turn away from those parts, we do the opposite and we welcome them in. And we breathe it in, the things that cause us bitter remorse or sharp cutting discontent. We welcome it in. So that's the giving on the in-breath. And then the receiving is that we let that part of us receive space. Rather than exiling it, we give it some of our inherent richness and remind it of our basic spacious nature. So we inhale and breathe in what hurts, and then we exhale and actually let it ventilate, rather than try to move it or eradicate it from the organism. So that's just a brief flirtation with the practice of Tonglen. We'll have a chance this evening to embody it. I want to speak a little bit more on dukkha. Because as complex as we think we are, and as nuanced and intricate as our difficulties seem to be, right? I think that there's an aspect of suffering where we feel like when we're in the depths of our own cave of misery, we feel like nobody could possibly understand the delicate situation of our own anguish. But really, if we get to the roots of our discontent, there's only a few ways that all humans suffer. And the Buddha suggested that really there are just 3 ways that our basic nature becomes distorted and we kind of get entangled in the roots of that which causes us suffering. And I feel that the Dharma is so helpful, not as a dogma to just kind of regurgitate the teachings, but to use this language as a scientific experimentation into your own experience of the times that you've been less than whole, and see if this list actually rings true for you. So dukkha is the first way that we suffer, right? Dukkha itself is that lack of space. But then dukkha is like the second wave. So dukkha as one word is just that first wave of experience. Something shitty happens. That's dukkha. That you cannot, no matter how intently you practice, ever eradicate the dukkha of life, the fluctuations of life, not getting your preferences met, getting rained out on a hike, breaking an ankle, losing a loved one. There's dukkha, and that's the first noble truth. And no matter what, that's a part of the path. Dukkha. That's how we relate to the things that are happening to us. So there are circumstances outside of our control, like getting sick. But dukkha would be the narrative after we get sick about how incapacitated we feel and how worried we are about how long this sickness is going to last, and the anger of why this has befallen on me, and wondering what I could have done differently. So the most painful thing in life is not the experiences that happen to us, but the narrative around those experiences. That's the revolutionary insight that the Buddha offers. Our relationship to dukkha. So practiced life becomes, meditation specifically, becomes the formal container where we learn to skillfully attend to dukkha, to loss, to sorrow, to discomfort, to anxiety. We learn to attend to sorrow. Like the Mama Gaia energy within, we just hold what's here now on our fertile soil. Unattended sorrow is perhaps one of the most difficult emotions to endure. When we don't give space for the parts within that are grieving, that's truly a burden to carry through the life course. A personal example. Because I really feel like even the most minor interpersonal losses, like a breakup, are brutal, potent teachers. And so I know one loss of a soul very dear to me who fed in the relationship that we had parts of me that hadn't been met by others. And that's the beauty of widening our capacities to be compassionate with different walks of life. We get to entertain parts of us that if you were just communing with a certain type of tribe, other parts would never be nurtured. So in this particular relationship, really felt within that parts of me were being watered that I didn't even know were thirsty. And I know in my own practiced life that different parts of me are more awake in different environments. And I'm very strategic about where I lead trainings because I feel that the energetics of the landscape do inform different types of inquiry and realization. So Sedona being a place I return to because I recognized probably in this relationship that the desert was one area or environment where parts of me just come alive jubilantly. So that desert texture to my soul was really celebrated in this relationship. And so were some important inquiries and the feeling of just being fully accepted and appreciated, almost worshipped even. I see the divinity in you, like that recognition of that part of my soul was just so nourishing. When that relationship was lost, there was the choice to cut that part of my soul out because it caused deep emotional pain to revisit it without the kind of intimacy of it being seen by another. So I recognized at that point that I could push that part to the wayside and focus on some other parts and other environments and really not have to revisit where I felt that lacking. But one of the central tenets of a non-judgmental, mindful practice is that all parts are welcome. And so that part that was grieving, I actually invited to the forefront to ask her how I might serve and fill that role. That part that felt really seen and loved. Can I give that to you? My inherent Buddha nature, offer that so that you don't feel the scarcity of loss. And so I spent a lot of time in the desert and also found friends and students that recognized and stirred up in me that same type of inquiry. So attending to the parts of me that craved what I had lost and seeing if I could actually still deliver it. Because then there's an empowerment within where we recognize we can really give ourselves all of the things that we need. I think that leads rather nicely into the second way that we suffer, which is called anicca dukkha. Anicca is change, or time, because time is the vehicle in which change happens. And we really suffer with change. When our ice cream didn't melt the day before, but something changed today and now it's melting, then that leads to some irritation. So that is perhaps best served by the antidote of the teaching of impermanence, that everything's going to change. It's natural to assume that the confluence of contingencies are constantly changing, so as not to attach to the states we find ourselves in when we're feeling really comfortable, because that's going to shift as well. So anicca dukkha is being resistant to the nowness, because right now, as time and the world passes through you, things are changing. And we can grasp to the way things were, or we can lean on what I really feel is humans' most skillful gift. Why we're superior as a species in so many ways, for sure inferior in others, but why we've kind of clambered to the top of the totem pole is because we're adaptable. We're not the strongest or the fastest or the most vicious. Not really sure at this point we're even the smartest. But we are adaptable. And I think in the midst of pandemic, that's really been demonstrated. So, in meditation practice, that becomes a way to relate to uncomfort as it passes through your seated formal practice, like when you're feeling fatigued, right? We're on day 3. There's maybe a sense of collapse in our inspiration or a slumping in the energy body, and we can really drown in the oppression of that, or we can recognize that it's an impermanent condition. And are we willing to still sit brightly, knowing that that's going to change? So it's an opportunity to bring impermanent constructs to the forefront of our intentionality rather than press them away, and just invite them to be seen so that the nature of that condition is illuminated. And this is really helpful in a yin pose where we start to feel pain. A skillful practitioner will know when pain has reached an edge that might cause detriment, like that short, sharp pain we feel of the nerves telling us something's gone awry. But then there's the pain of discomfort, because we're a creature of comfort. We really would prefer to feel juicy and supported than edgy. But you can watch pain as an experience transform in the practice, particularly when it's fed with breath of life, and our edges soften, and we might move into a deeper range of motion or more capacitated endurance to deal with discomfort as it arises. So we're not trying to shift things, we're just trying to explore or observe the patterns of endurance, which I'll suggest is a wave-like endurance, where a sensation or feeling tone comes into the body, it peaks and crests and dissolves and blends or melts into giving rise to a new wave of experience. So we can be like the shunyata, open sky, where we watch those clouds pass, or we can just drown in the turbulence of waves crashing around us, hoping that we won't get wet. And then lastly, the third way we suffer is this lack of awareness that we call avidya dukkha. So vidya means awareness, remembrance. Means lack of, right? Like dukkha, lack of space, avidya, lack of awareness. And we suffer constantly in gross or extremely subtle ways when we forget our inner Buddha. When we attach to parts of us that say, the parts of us that turned online at a younger age when we felt vulnerable and lacking, the parts of us that say, I'm not enough, I'm not worthy, I don't have what it takes, I don't know if I can do this. The state of the unchanging essence underneath the wave-like endurance of experience, underneath that, there's Buddha nature, which is unperturbed, unstruck by the changing climates of different weather patterns passing through the atmosphere within. So avidya dukkha is when we feel like we don't belong, when we feel inadequate or insecure or unworthy. And the way that we antidote that is continuously turning towards an intrinsic sense of value. Not because you've done something right, just because you're here and you serve as a living testament to the inner altar where perfection reigns. Again, we need our Buddha nature to be pointed out for us. We need to be reminded from others because we forget all the time who we really are. So we need somebody else, we need teachers to suggest that this is true, that you have Buddha nature. It sparks in us this primordial understanding of our basic goodness. It's called the law of inherent goodness because from a very young age, no matter how benevolent the intentionality of our parents were, we're taught that there are parts of our personality structure that are wrong or bad or need to be fixed. And I really feel like the education system lacks a liberated space where we can celebrate the eccentricities of the young student and nurture those aspects rather than encouraging conformity to a more narrowed social realm where some behaviors are accepted and others are to be eradicated. So we need to be reminded that we're actually inherently good. No matter how many mistakes we've made, you will cause others harm. And for sure ourselves too. But irrespective of the clumsiness of walking the path, we're basically Buddha. So we need to be reminded and taught, and then we need to train in it lifelong. Bhavana, cultivation, means we return every day to the inner altar to just refill our reserves so that we're constantly being quenched, because we'll forget who we really are. So again, the Tibetan Book of the Dead starts many of its chapters with similar prose. O nobly born, O you who are the sons and the daughters of the awakened ones, remember who you truly are. So let's find a forward bend and just let that kind of wisdom seep through. A few options.